I think that Jack expected something different at DC. He expected whatever he expected, and whatever he was dissatisfied with at Marvel, he expected a new ball game. And I don't think that Jack got a new ball game. I think he got the same old ball game.
If in 1970 DC or Marvel had given Jack the exact same contract they gave newcomers in 1985, Jack would have been very happy. He would have gotten the credit and money he deserved. But in 1970, when he said, well, you know, I should have some sort of sales bonus in this thing, they told him, no, we can't do that. No, we can't share the copyright on this stuff. No, we can't pay you, we can't return your original art to you. We can't do all these things that later became very standard. Jack was told in the 60s and 70s the business cannot do these, legally, morally, functionally. And one of the rewards Jack had was that he lived to see the comic book business change exactly the way he always knew it would have to change. And of course the sad part was that he was not in a position to benefit directly from those changes.
I think that sometimes you can be too good and people consider it a threat. I mean, Jack was awfully good. You know, Jack really had no ambitions besides doing what he was doing. But sometimes people interpret it differently. I don't know.
Jack went back to Marvel in 1975. His relationship with DC had soured. He wasn't happy there. Marvel wanted him back. They were willing to treat him marginally better than DC at a time when that mattered. I don't think any company ever treated him commensurate with his worth or value to the company. But he went back to Marvel in 1975 unhappily and did Captain America again. He did a book called The Eternals. He did The Black Panther. He did a book called 2001 based on the movie. He did a book called Machine Man that spun off of that. He did a very weird comic called Devil Dinosaur that was kind of created to be a Saturday morning cartoon show but never became one. And he wasn't happy there, and finally he just got out of comics pretty much. He got into animation.
When Kirby left Marvel, I'm much less of a fan of his DC work. The Marvel work was really the top of it all for me. But Kirby is also so unique in that, and I talked to other creators about this, he's the only person I know that in 3 decades was the top man in his field and reinvented himself each time. So the way he drew when he created Captain America was different than the way that he drew when he sort of created the romance comics and monster comics in the 50s. And then the way that he drew at Marvel, creating the FF, and it just within a few years, if you look at from 61 to 65, it's totally different and better every time. And this is, 30 years down the line. So for a guy to have that kind of intense creativity that long, that many pages into his career is unprecedented.
You probably heard this from other people, actually, because it's always a surprise when you meet Jack Kirby. I met him in '68. He was still living in New York, on Long Island. And I was astonished that he wasn't 35 feet tall. That's the biggest thing, I saw that. I mean, I knew what he looked like because he'd done a cartoon of himself, for some Marvel thing, And he always had a cigar, classic stuff, He was James Cagney, basically.
He was about 5'6". He sort of reminded me a little bit of a cross between sort of Jimmy Cagney, sort of George Burns.
In my youthful mind, I saw him as a cross between Galactus and Reed Richards with some Ben Grimm in his voice, in his locution. But anyway, he was the sweetest guy you could ever meet. He was the star of comics, hands down.
He had a wonderful way with people. Jack was the kind of person who, it didn't matter who you were, he treated everyone the same. If you were a 13-year-old kid came up to him and showed him your drawing, he would look at it and say, hey, that's really nice, that's good, you should do this, but keep at it and this. If you were a celebrity that came up to you, he was the same way. He was like, hi, how you doing? Oh. And he would say, well, so what do you do? And he'd start, he was really interested in people.
Because my father was just such a, he was such a humble person that he just never had any kind of, ego about him whatsoever.
You have to remember that prior to, let's say, 1970, he pretty much worked in anonymity. I mean, back in Long Island, he worked in what he called the cave, which was the basement of their home in East Williston. And that's where he was. He would draw the books, once a week he'd go into the city.
And during that period at Marvel, in terms of looking at it as a standpoint of home life, at that point, he was doing so many books and churning out so much work. He was working, I don't know how many years, 12, 14 hours a day, a lot of weekends. We lost a lot of weekends. And from a standpoint of being a kid, again, I never thought much about it. It was, it was his job. And of course, he was working at home. So, if I ever needed anything, I could just go downstairs and see him and watch TV with him.
Jack drew most of the early Marvel superhero things in a little airless room at his house in New York, which he called the Dungeon.
Back east, all the houses have basements. And this particular studio, I remember because it was just called the Dungeon because it was just tiny and cramped and full of his stuff piled up, and there was like no light. And that's where he worked. It was quiet. He didn't really care about his surroundings that much.
It was described to me as having a wall full of science fiction paperbacks, which he would occasionally reach behind himself and pick one up and riff through it to get an idea. He'd pull a phrase out of it, and that would generate an entire new concept somehow. I would go in there and the TV would be on, a radio would be on. Sometimes I'd go in there and he'd have the Spanish station on. He doesn't know any Spanish, but he just liked the sound or the music or just any kind of background, that would help him, I guess, as far as his work or just keep him occupied.
When they lived in East Williston and he worked in the basement, occasionally fans would come and see him, but there really wasn't a place where people would go and you could meet the guys that drew the comics.
Yeah, we came over for milk and cookies on Saturdays.
Yeah.
We would just drive over.
His Roz would force us to have something to eat because
you couldn't go to a Jewish house without having a sandwich.
Exactly. So we'd have a sandwich first, then we'd go downstairs to his office, and he'd be drawing away, and he'd be talking to us the whole time. It was just incredible, and nothing ever stopped him from drawing the whole time he was talking.
Yeah. Hand was always moving, producing.
Jack had this old drawing board that he had hauled across the country. When he moved from New York to Los Angeles, it was the last thing they put on the van and the first thing they took off in Southern California because he had to go back to work. And it was this beat up. I had a better drawing table when I was 12 years old than Jack Kirby had most of his life.
It was beaten up and battered. It was, fairly standard drawing table, ink all over it, smudged from graphite.
He sat in this rigid back wooden dining room chair from a dinette set that the family no longer owned.
It's the most uncomfortable thing you'd ever want to sit in.
They'd thrown out everything except the one chair that Jack liked.
He would sit in that chair just kind of like this, just like that. He's right-handed. And he would just, cigar here when he smoked, and he'd just start. Just go through the night like that.
He used plain old-fashioned pencils, plain old-fashioned paper, an old beat-up ruler. Somehow it just, happened.
I remember when we first moved, it was basically for health reasons, because my mother was an asthmatic, and she wasn't always a real well woman, and then I was always sick all the time as well.
A doctor just said it was, either Arizona or California, is where she needed to go. And they had some cousins out here, so they initially moved to Irvine, to the only housing I think that was built in Irvine at the time. And that was in '68. They lived in Irvine for a year or two, but of course they didn't have any relatives or friends there. My mother had some cousins up in Thousand Oaks, so they found a nice little piece of land there and built a home up in Thousand Oaks, moved up there in 1970.
I met Jack in July of 1969, a couple weeks after I got out of high school. We had a comic book club in L.A. I was the president of it, and our officers went down and met him. And we sat there all day with our jaws open, listening to Jack discourse on comics and comic history. And right in the middle of the day, the phone rang, and it was Stan Lee calling to discuss the next issue of Fantastic Four, and my friends and I just kind of sat there tingling. We were witnessing the magic happening firsthand. And he was this wonderful, gracious host who would answer all our questions and showed us all this artwork he was doing. It was the first time I'd seen uninked Jack Kirby artwork. And my friends and I were just babbling idiots, pretty much the way I'm babbling right now. Or we were babbling back then. We couldn't believe we were looking at.
To me, Jack, I don't think he even knew who he was talking to sometimes. We were all kind of one lump thing of his admirers. And he never treated us like a number or anything like that. We were all important to him. But we were just faces and people that would come in and out of his house to tell him our own personal stories about why we would want to make a trek to his house in the first place. Why Jack Kirby was so important to us. And that's the way he took it, just as an offering of gratitude and thanks to everyone that would show up at his doorstep.
We had these people, and people would just show up sometimes. I mean, their phone number was listed, and people knew where they lived, and they were some kind of UFO cult. And my father just wanted to take my father with them and beam him up to wherever it is they were. And he just let them in and showed them around. My mom made them lunch, and that's how it was at my house. They were just so open to everyone. You know, no one was ever discouraged at all. It was just an open door policy. So they were just real humble people and very caring. My mother was always feeding everybody, you know, typical Jewish mother, I guess.